So what I want to do now is just summarize a couple of the key points from the last live lecture that I gave. 1, politics is in some significant measure about power, wealth, and prestige, and how governments and people in government use those resources to make public policy. 2nd, the definition of politics is very important, and it's a source, it's a site of struggle. Some people, some political actors in all societies and in all governments want government's role to be relatively small and understand politics as a very limited activity. Others see it in a much broader way. Thirdly, this is related to issues of all the decisions in a society, whether it's ours or Thailand or Great Britain. Who is going to make those decisions? What role will governments play in making those decisions? To what degree will they be publicly made decisions? To what degree will they be privately made decisions, or some mix? 4, it's important to keep in mind that democracy in most of modern history and most of American history has been seen as a negative thing. Democracy, there are a lot of different definitions of democracy, but basically one very simple definition is broader involvement, participation, and power of the people in the making, in running government, or at least getting government representation in government and helping to shape public policies. That is what governments do. Those who are most powerful in all societies, whether it's ours or Colombia or Brazil or Japan, those who are most powerful don't want the great many people to participate in politics, and so they push back against that. Finally, the framers, and the rest of my talk today is going to be about the Constitution. We might get into federalism. The framers had a very difficult challenge placed before them. They wanted to scuttle, they wanted to get rid of the Articles of Confederation, which were ineffective, as the text indicates, in a number of ways. They wanted a much stronger, more viable national government at the same time as they wanted a limited government. And so their solution, I think, was to create a fragmented and inefficient government that would represent as many, or include as many interests and points of view and actors as possible. And so what today, you're going to have heard, you're going to be somewhat knowledgeable about a lot of this material, but so I want to talk about the principles of the Constitution and start with separation of powers, checks and balances, and federalism, and what these things are and what they mean. Any comments or questions?
No.
Okay, so one of the most important things about the Constitution is the preamble. And I put the preamble up on the slide here. And the language is important. The words are important. And I think what the words say, what they convey, is what I would call the public purposes of the Constitution. A more perfect union, much better than the Articles. Establish justice. Ensure domestic tranquility. Provide for the common defense. Promote the general welfare. And then secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. So my reading of this is that what the framers are saying is the purpose of the Constitution, the purposes of the Constitution are union, justice, order, common defense, and general welfare. And if we do these things successfully, we will have liberty for ourselves and our posterity. That's the way I read this. When you make a list of something, you put the thing that's most important first. When they wrote the Bill of Rights, the most important was not the 10th Amendment, it was the First Amendment. When they wrote the preamble to the Constitution, the first thing is the most important. It's obvious because of the practical and real situation that the framers faced, and that was a government that didn't work and was disintegrating. Union was the most important goal at the time. So, constitutional design and principles. Understand that my analysis probably and description here may not always fit with the textbook. I don't intend to just repeat the textbook. If so, if I were, you don't need me. You can just read the book. Sometimes the book is very good in my view. Sometimes it's flat out wrong in my view. I'm going to let you know where I think that is. Differences of opinion are normal in politics. So, constitutional design and principles revolve around the separation of powers, the checks and balances, creation of a federal system. And if you take all these together, what do they mean? What do they mean? What are they about? Well, what they're about is, first, representing different interests and the need for those interests to compromise. Secondly, they're about fragmenting the structures of government in a way that makes it slow and relatively inefficient. Thirdly, and I'm going to talk about these in more detail. Thirdly, the principle of anti-majoritarianism. The framers wanted to create a governmental system where it was almost impossible for majorities to form. I know that since age 2 we've been told majority rules in a democracy. That's not what the framers were about. That's changed over time, but that's not what the framers were about. They wanted limited and representative government in one sense or another. They wanted multiple access points. That is a governmental system where people and groups and political actors could access the political process and the political system, and where change, therefore, would be difficult. But keep in mind, I know this is hard, keep in mind, most adults under the new Constitution had no political rights. Native Americans had no political rights. Black adults had no political rights. Women had no political rights. Most unpropertied white males had no political rights. Most adult people in the country had few, if any, political or any other rights. Why do I talk about this? I talk about this because in our society today, for a number of reasons, we tend to think it's all about rights. The framers didn't talk all about rights. If they wanted to talk all about rights, they would have started out talking about rights. They didn't talk about rights. They talked about forming a more perfect union, because that's what they were about. That's what the Constitution is, an effort to form a national government. Okay, separation of powers. Divides governmental power among several institutions. Power must be used to balance power. Interests balance other interests. And so, as you know, there are 3 branches of government: the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judiciary. They have separate but related functions. Powers are divided. Article 1 lays out the powers of and the description of the legislature, the Congress. The single most important thing about Article 1 is it is Article 1 because the framers did think that the Congress would be the premier policy-making body. Number 2, it lays out explicit powers of the Congress and then follows up with the necessary and proper clause in Article 1, Section 8, and there's the words on it, on the slide. To make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by the Constitution and the government of the United States, etc. This is a broad granting of power to the Congress of the United States. And it's right there in Article 1, and if you don't get it, then you miss a lot. Because what the framers are doing is saying, Congress, any power, any function, any role that this Constitution describes for the federal government, you have the power, you have the authority under the Constitution to see that that's done. Article 2, the executive branch. And the thing about the executive branch, and I'm going to go over this very rapidly at this point because we'll talk about it in much greater detail later in the term. But the key duties and powers of the President under the Constitution, Article 2, are expressed powers are President as Commander-in-Chief, and the President and or executive, as head of the executive branch, must take care that the laws are faithfully executed. Understand what this means. It is important. Take care that the laws are faithfully executed means that the President and the executive branch determine how the laws passed by Congress are in fact implemented. This is both a policy-making and a law-making power. Let me try to give you an example. Ivy Tech Community College offers a course called Introduction to American Government and Politics, POLS 101. There is a piece of paper that's centrally created that says, here are all the things that are supposed to be in this course. One page. But the implementation of this course, for better or worse, is mine. Nobody, yes, they ask me to, they want to, administrators want to see my syllabus. I have to, but mainly it has to do with have I put everything on the syllabus that needs to be on there. But they're not checking up on me. Yes, they determine centrally maybe the half dozen books that can be used statewide in an introductory American government class. But I get to pick which one. And I write the lectures. And I give the lectures. And I do the grading. And assuming I don't, as long as I don't do something that's grossly inappropriate that gets reported, my implementation is the course. And that implementation will be my sense, my best sense of what an introductory American government course should be given the description. And it's the same thing with what the executive branch does with laws passed by Congress. Article 3 describes the judiciary. The only court established by Article 3 is the Supreme Court of the United States, and all other federal courts are in fact created by the Congress. President nominates, we'll get to that later on in the course. As you probably know, presidents nominate federal justices. They're confirmed by the Senate of the United States. And the Supreme Court's powers include resolving conflicts between federal and state laws, determining how power should be allocated between different levels of government, and settling controversies between citizens of different states, among others. The Supreme Court interprets the law consistent with its view of the Constitution. One of the things the text talks about is that I'll get to it. I'll come back to that. Okay, that's separation of powers. Three branches. And what checks and balances do is to require these three different branches to share powers. Checks and balances are mechanisms through which each branch is able to participate in and influence the activities of other branches. And I'm going to show you an image of this in a minute. Things like the veto power that the president has, the Congress's power to override vetoes, the Senate's power to approve presidential appointments and treaties, and it goes on and on. So what we have as a consequence of checks and balances is separate institutions sharing powers. And this image, which I believe is taken from the text, shows you some of the reciprocal checks and balances among the three major national governmental institutions. There are a lot of them. You should know them. Even more important than knowing them is understand what they mean. And what they mean is, among other things, that no institution, what the framers were trying to do is to prevent any single branch, judicial, executive, or congressional, from exercising unilateral authority and power. The federal system is also an effort to fragment power. It divides power. Federalism is a governmental system which divides power between a central government and subnational governments. That is, governments at a regional or an area or a district or a state or provincial, depending, it's different in different countries, but the idea is to have a national government but then have subnational governments. And what a federal system does is to make, among other things, is to make the relations between subnational governments more important and relationships between subnational governments and the national government important. We call that in political science intergovernmental relations. I think it's fair to say that in a federal system, certainly in our own federal system, that system is a system both of tension or conflict and a system of cooperation. It is not inherently one or the other. Over time, and usually at the same time, it will be both. One of the things that people like to do in trying to understand the world and to understand politics is say it's either this or that. You only be one of two things. It's Pepsi or Coke. It's Democrat, Republican. It's right, left. Ain't that simple. Relations between the national government and subnational governments can be both cooperative in some ways and conflictual in other ways. And it depends on a whole range of circumstances. what those relations are going to be like. It also is not the case that simply because one quote-unquote level of government, say the national government, gains additional powers, that state and local governments that therefore must necessarily lose those powers. That's not true at all. Example, in 1970, when Richard Nixon was president, he signed the National Environmental Protection Act. That was the first major post-World War II environmental legislation in our country. It created, among other things, the Environmental Protection Agency. One of the consequences of that was that states, most of which had no environmental protection agencies at all, created their own and began to create their own environmental protection and environmental quality laws. So rather than diminish the powers of states, that law actually allowed states to expand their power to protect the environment in the state, to protect and safeguard rivers and streams and forests and all the amenities of life in the state that make it a nice place to live. So, earlier I talked about fragmentation of power in our government that the Constitution really helped create. That fragmentation is driven by a number of things, but what I need you to understand is that in 1789, and still to some extent, to a significant degree today, different constituencies are represented. And this is a deliberate strategy designed to prevent majorities from forming. Hear me out. The House of Representatives was directly elected by the people in congressional districts, the people, of course, being the white men who were allowed to vote initially. They served 2-year terms. They were the only national political officials in 1789 that were elected directly by those who had voting rights. I'm going to repeat that. Not only did a very small minority of Americans under the new Constitution get to vote, but the only directly elected representative were members of the House of Representatives. The members of the Senate were elected by state legislatures at the time. That was changed in the first 20 years of the 20th century. The president was elected, and vice president were elected by the Electoral College. People didn't vote for candidate X or candidate Y for president. They were voting for a body of electors who would then select the president. The Supreme Court and federal courts were created by Congress and nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate and served for life. Senators were elected for 6-year terms, presidents and vice presidents 4-year terms. So what's going on here is an effort to prevent most people from voting, to prevent direct election of most people in the national government, and to prevent their being selected at the same time. So various parts of the Constitution I want to call to your attention. Article 6 is the Supremacy Clause. It provides that the Constitution is the law of the land and that it takes precedence over state sovereignty or state law when there is a conflict. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. But basically, this is saying, okay, states, you have to recognize what each other is doing and respect it. Reciprocity in Article 4, you can't discriminate against citizens from other states. And the powers of the Constitution, this is important. There are at least 4 different types of powers in the Constitution that political scientists describe. One is enumerated or expressed. They're right out there in black and white in the Constitution. The Congress has the power to coin money. The Congress has the power to declare war. The Senate has the power to ratify a treaty. These are enumerated powers. Implied powers are those that have been interpreted by the courts and sometimes by Congress to be associated with the president and the executive branch, especially with respect to foreign policy. Very hard for 535 members of Congress to make foreign policy. And so the head of state is presumed to have, and as commander-in-chief, has some implied powers that a head of state has with respect to foreign affairs. Concurrent powers are often overlooked. Concurrent powers in the Constitution are those that can be exercised simultaneously and appropriately by both the national government and state governments. The idea that national government laws must always conflict with and damage or harm state powers and laws won't fly, because there are concurrent powers that both can exercise. Doesn't mean that there's never any conflict between the national government and state government. It simply means that there's no quote-unquote zero-sum game. It's simply not the case that every time one level, quote-unquote, exercises power, it therefore diminishes the other. That's just not so. And finally, reserved powers described in the 10th Amendment. Keep in mind, the 10th Amendment is the last amendment in the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights was added, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, was added to the Constitution 2 years after the Constitution was ratified. There are those who would like to think that states' rights trump the powers of the national government. Ain't so. The Supremacy Clause, Article 6, Section 2, says it ain't so. And keep in mind, the 10th Amendment was not even an original part of the Constitution. If you're looking to the framers and their views, their view was not that Article 10, that Amendment 10 triumphed. If that was their view, they'd have put in the Constitution. They didn't. They didn't. What they were about is creating a national government, and once they got done doing that, 2 years later, they added, oh, and by the way, Amendment 10. It doesn't mean it's insignificant. It means that the framers, this was not first and foremost, or even second or third on the list of what the framers were about. They tell you what they're about in the preamble. Text talks about the conflict between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Basically, the Anti-Federalists were worried about a stronger national government. They were in the minority in the Constitutional Convention by far. They had a lot of power at the time of ratification. The Anti-Federalists are more those who wanted small, limited government, were more inclined to support something like the Articles. And the Articles went down. And so the challenge that the framers had was, how do you create a much stronger, unified national government that at the same time is limited in its powers? No easy feat. This is in the text. I'm going to skip over it. It's very important, but I'm going to skip over it. So, the Constitution was ratified, but wasn't just ratified. It was ratified. Keep in mind, it was very close. There were a lot of opponents to the new Constitution. And so Madison and the Federalists basically said, okay, look, they knew they needed 9 of the 13 states to ratify. They said, okay, we hear you. We'll prepare a Bill of Rights to limit the power of the national government over individual citizens and their property. Now that we've said that, please support the ratification. You ratify, we'll add them to the Constitution. That's the way it went down. It was a political compromise. Had the Federalists been assured that they had the political power of a majority in the state legislatures to pass and ratify the Constitution, there probably wouldn't have been a Bill of Rights. A Bill of Rights was a political compromise to win votes. That doesn't make it a bad thing, but that's the historic reality. And it was adopted 2 years later, after ratification. Now, here is something that's incredibly important and still has relevance today. The Bill of Rights was universally understood as a limit on the power of the federal government. And you should read the Bill of Rights to see what exactly those limits were and are. And a lot of them have to do with the criminal justice system and the rights of defendants and those charged with crimes. But what you need to remember is the Bill of Rights, when it was adopted, was never by anybody understood as applying to state and local governments. We have this fantasy, I'll call it a fantasy, this myth, if you prefer, that state and local governments are closer to the people, and so they're less likely to take our rights away. The federal government's further away. It's in Washington, D.C., and it's more likely as a national government to be oppressive. I got news for you. The Bill of Rights applied only to the national government in 1791. It did not apply to the state and local governments. In fact, read in the text about, and I also talk about it in subsequent video lectures, about the incorporation doctrine. It took at least a century for the federal courts to apply the Bill of Rights to state and local governments. This idea that state and local governments are not oppressive, that all the oppression comes from Washington, D.C., is just malarkey. It was the national government that was supposed to respect individual liberties, not state and local governments. They could, if they chose, state governments, if they chose, and many did, could adopt their own Bill of Rights. But nobody forced them to. One other point about the Bill of Rights. and the Constitution generally. It is not self-implementing. There's no magic witch out there or magic wizard with a wand that guarantees that all of these protections will be honored by governments and government officials. In fact, every day of your life, people's rights as established under the Bill of Rights will be violated by a government agency or government officials. Not because they're being jerks or because they're oppressive, but because they're doing this as a way consistent with the way they understand their job is to be done. And we can quarrel about whether that's a good thing or not. But the Bill of Rights is not self-implementing. Nothing is self-implementing. No law, no regulation, no Bill of Rights, no amendment, no constitutional power is self-implementing. It takes human beings organized in one or another form to make the Constitution, to make laws reality. So, you don't read about this much, you don't hear about this much, but it seems to me to be true. State and local government violations of individual rights in a world where slavery existed and most adults had few, if any, civil and political rights, were a regular part of life in the states and localities. And the federal government did nothing about it because the Bill of, or almost nothing about it because the Bill of Rights applied only to the national government. And eventually, this is, you know, arguably one of the things that the Civil War was about. Well, maybe slavery doesn't work. Maybe we need to move beyond that. And that's pretty hard to negotiate or compromise on. As Lincoln suggested, you can't have a country that's half slave, half free. There is an amendment process that's built into the Constitution. It is an example of how the framers wanted a large supermajority to change the Constitution. What's important here is we haven't had a constitutional amendment in over 20 years, probably closer to 30. There are two methods that are laid out. It's important for you to know those, but it's not the most important thing. The most important thing you need to know is that, at least in the current political climate, it is highly likely that the formal amendment process is in something in writing only and cannot be done, cannot be accomplished. My best example of that is the long-standing effort to pass a constitutional amendment that would prohibit the burning of the American flag. This is a response that some in the Congress have made to a Supreme Court decision which overturned the Texas law many years ago during the Vietnam War. And if you can't get a constitutional amendment passed to prohibit burning of the flag, that suggested, or for that matter, the Equal Rights Amendment, the idea that women have equal rights under the Constitution as men, that didn't pass either. So if you can't pass that, what can you pass? There's an image of the process. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because what's more important is that of the 11,000 amendments or so that have been considered, only 27 have been ratified. That's not even 1%. Okay, so what this slide does, I'm not going to go through this because a lot of this is in the text, but if a formal amendment process doesn't work very well very often, we've got a lot of changes over 200 plus years. These are some of the most important changes that have demanded national government and state governments to do things a bit differently, to look at things in new ways. So I want to summarize briefly, and then I want to take some questions if you have any, and then I'll talk about a couple of the slides on federalism that were missed. The anti-federalists were concerned about governmental tyranny. They were concerned about concentrated government power. They were more identified with states' rights, with localism, individual liberty. This is reflected in the anti-majoritarian nature of the Constitution. They wanted individual liberties to be first and foremost. In some ways, what this is part of the legacy of American populism. And the framers themselves were attuned to thinking about politics as a conflict between the many people without property and the wealthy few who had it. And one way to think about politics is to think about it in terms of a conflict between the many on the one hand, not just in the United States, by the way, but everywhere, conflict between the many and those with a tremendous amount of money and property. This is not just about the United States in this sense. What I want to leave you with is an appreciation for the ambiguity of the Revolution and the Constitution in the 18th century. My argument is simple, yet complicated. The Revolution and the Constitution were both revolutionary and at the same time conservative. Radical, yet conservative. Both together. Not one or the other, both. How was it revolutionary? First, the framers and Jefferson's Declaration rejected monarchy, rejected authoritarian power, rejected state religion. That's the way things were done in the last quarter of the 18th century. They said, no, we're not doing that. The Declaration is radical in the idea of human equality. The Declaration, and to some degree the Constitution, were revolutionary in the idea that societies and governments are formed as a consequence of a social contract among people who have rights prior to the formation of government. How do you think a monarch would take that? Forget that. Your rights are what I tell you they are. Your rights are the same that they've always been in a traditional society. The same rights that your parents had. The same rights that their parents had. You can work the land. You're a peasant. The idea that people could come together as individuals and as groups, that they had rights prior to government, that they could literally create a government or a constitution, that's radical. At the same time, the framers were conservative. They didn't live in a world where democracy was seen as a positive thing. They didn't live in a world where rule by the many or even representative democracy was respected and even admired. They lived in a world of slaves and slavery. They lived in a world of a slave trade. They lived in a world of a slave economy. They lived in a world where most people owned no property. They lived in a world clearly where women were seen as subservient to and generally without rights, subservient to men and without rights in the larger society and political system. So revolutionary, radical, yep, but also conservative. Comments at this point? Or questions? Anyone there? Hello? Any comments or questions?
Alan's questions? Yeah.
No, I have questions.
If there are any, fire away.
They said they had no
Okay.
questions.
I want to just fill in a couple gaps in the federalism lecture.
No.
I have to quit a few minutes to 1. Is that correct? I'm going to put up another PowerPoint in a minute.
Yes.
Is there anyone who has not at least seen or gone through this PowerPoint on the federal system and has not seen the video lecture on federalism?
There appears to be one.
Okay. Is that Allison?
Oh, my bad. There are 3 to 4.
Okay. Okay, well, those, at a minimum, you should be able to see the PowerPoint under, I think, class session 3. I'm going to go through this really quickly because we're so far behind. We talked about, I'm going to try to get to it, I don't know that I'll be able to do it. I'll try to get to slide 15 so that it fills the gap in any case. Okay, we already defined federalism. It's a governmental system where authority is divided between national and subnational governments. By the way, keep in mind, I didn't mention this, I think it was on a slide though, that the Constitution makes no provision whatsoever for local governments. There is no mention of local government anywhere in the Constitution of the United States. Local governments are creatures of state governments. Pure and simple. So we're talking about national and subnational governments. When we're talking about a federal system, this is an organization chart, plus or minus, of the federal government. You should take a look at it. The 3 branches are here, cabinet level departments here, executive branch agencies, independent agencies there. This is an image of generic federalism, where you have the central government in the kind of orangish yellow, orangish, I guess. You have states or provinces or regions. It varies from one country to another what they call them. In the United States, obviously, it's states. Then there are local districts or shires or counties or provinces, what have you. Then there are the taxpayers. So there are levels of government in a federal system between central government and the people. This is taken from the text, I believe. There are almost 90,000 governmental bodies in the United States of America. You know, overwhelming majority of them are local governments. One of the things that's interesting and amusing at the same time, perhaps, is that we say we don't really like politics or government very much. We sure have a lot of it, and the great majority of it is local governmental bodies. There are arguments for and against federalism. They are discussed in your text. They're very important, both the advantages and disadvantages, and you should review those in the text as well as on the slides. Because of time limits, I'm not going to talk about them today. These are some of the arguments against the federal system. In general, these are some of the arguments for a federal system. The political reality of the United States of America suggests that we will always have a federal system, and that, you know, unless something really transformative occurs, and that it is a source of ongoing conflict, political conflict, and controversy in our country and in the Constitution and in how we read the Constitution. This was by design. This was by design. A built-in tension that was manifested most radically by the Civil War. And so, if you wish, if you think that government should be efficient, and that should be the primary or a primary value of American government, you need to understand that the framers simply disagreed. They had no interest in efficiency. Nobody who fragments power in so many different ways. If I told you you don't have one set of parents, you got 4 sets of parents. You got 8 parents, each one of you. And nothing happens until at least 6 or 7 of them agree. Not 2, 6 or 7. You can see that things aren't going to get done very quickly. And you can also see that if you had 4 or 5 different sets of parents, that they would probably disagree among themselves on a whole range of issues. What kind of house you should live in, how much you should pay for it, what kind of car you should buy, whether you should lease or buy, what school system you should be in, and so on. When you invite everybody and his brother to the party, it can get complicated. So this is the supremacy clause I talked about earlier that just that simply says that national government laws preempt state and local regulations when there's a conflict. Okay, this is one of my major disagreements with Bartas. That's the author of the text. On page 91, the Supreme Court defines the powers of the national government. Other place she says, the Supreme Court casts the final vote on what government will do. This is just not true. The Supreme Court is the Supreme Court in the federal judiciary. The Congress can pass legislation to work around a Supreme Court ruling. The President and the Senate can respectively nominate and confirm justices who may overturn a court ruling. Furthermore, the courts do not generally implement their decisions. Somebody else needs to. The wonderful example, two real wonderful examples here, the Brown v. Board decision and the Miranda ruling. What's one of the most important Supreme Court decisions in the last 61 years was Brown versus Board of Education, a unanimous Supreme Court decision to hold segregation by law unconstitutional in public schools K through 12, and that therefore desegregation should proceed with all deliberate speed. Today, there's no more integration in public schools than there was 61 years ago. Who implemented that decision? Who ultimately implemented that decision? School boards from around the country, not the Supreme Court. And so it didn't get implemented. And people had other workarounds and other choices they could make with regard to schools, private schools, for example. The Miranda ruling. You all watch cop shows on TV. The Miranda ruling said, okay, policemen, if you're going to arrest somebody, you've got to read them their rights. So, in the real world, the way this often works is police officer will arrest somebody. They'll read them their rights, and they'll say, okay, talk. What happened? And the pressure is on the person who just got arrested. Well, we'll make it easier on you if you talk now. So the police officer ultimately is the person who has to implement that ruling. And so it may be, in theory, honored, but just as often it's not. So one of the arguments I've made is that the framers built political conflict between states and the national government into the Constitution of the United States. And we talked about these various powers already, and so I won't mention them again at this point. And we talked about the reserve powers, so I'm not going to talk about that again. We already mentioned that local governments have no status in the Constitution. We'll move on. We talked about concurrent powers, so we'll move on. Okay, the doctrine of national supremacy was again reinforced by the McCulloch versus Maryland decision in 1819. The Gibbons v. Ogden decision 5 years later defined the Commerce Clause and recognized the Congress as having exclusive power with respect to regulating interstate commerce. So the big challenge was the Civil War. Do states have the power to secede? Yes, they have the power if they can make it stick. In the case of the Civil War 150 years ago, they didn't. They couldn't make it stick. In discussions of federalism, the text talks about dual federalism and cooperative federalism, and this is one of the major changes in the federal system in the United States. Up until about 1930, the layer cake federalism was the way it was understood. You had the state governments here, you had the federal government here, and there was basically very little interaction. And that's began to transform during the 1930s into what some called, I think, probably mistakenly, cooperative federalism. So these are some of the social, economic, and political forces and global forces that have brought about transformations not only in how we understand the Constitution, but how the federal system works. I'm going to stop here. What I want to be able to do, I'll probably pick up on this next time. How many of you, have any of you read Chapter 5 yet on civil rights?
Some have.
Okay. Okay. I think what I'm going to do next time is ask you for tomorrow. We'll hopefully meet at 9:45. Please review the rest of this federalism slide. What I want to talk about, I'm going to assume that you've read it, looked it over fairly carefully. What I want to talk about is going to start here. Competitive federalism. Why don't more of the states and local governments do more? And I want to talk about changes in state-federal relationships, and I want to talk about these last couple slides in federalism that deal with the work of a very important political scientist named E.E. Schachtschneider. So I'll see you next time. Hopefully it'll be at 9:45 tomorrow morning, and I'll post that on the Blackboard course. Please feel free to either call or email, not email, but course message, or post questions about the course. And Allison, if you're there, remember to call me once you get home. Talk to you guys tomorrow.
Thanks.